Sunday morning brought more media attention than anyone had expected. The story of the deployed soldier whose house was stolen by his HOA had spread across the country overnight. News vans from 3 different television stations were parked on Maple Street, and reporters were interviewing neighbors about what had happened. Marcus woke up in his hotel room to find dozens of missed calls and text messages. Some were from reporters wanting interviews, but many were from other military families who had experienced similar problems with HOAs while deployed. The story had touched a nerve with people across the country who were outraged that military families could be treated this way. At 8 o'clock in the morning, Marcus received a call from Patricia Wells. Her voice was shaky and she sounded like she had not slept all night. "Sergeant Chen, I need to speak with you. Can you come to my house?" "Mrs. Wells, my fellow soldiers and I are very interested in continuing our educational program about HOA policies. We'll be there shortly." When the soldiers arrived at Patricia Wells's house, they found a very different scene than the day before. Patricia Wells answered the door immediately and she looked exhausted and defeated. Behind her stood the other 4 HOA board members, all looking equally uncomfortable. "Sergeant Chen, please come in. We need to talk." Marcus entered the house with Tony Rodriguez and Jake Sullivan while the other soldiers waited respectfully outside. The living room was filled with nervous HOA board members who looked like they were attending their own funeral. "Sergeant Chen," Patricia Wells began, "the board has been meeting all night. We've decided that there may have been some misunderstandings about your situation." "Misunderstandings?" "The rental of your property was handled by a third-party management company. The board was not fully informed about all the details of your deployment status." Marcus looked at her carefully. "Mrs. Wells, are you saying that you didn't know I was deployed when you authorized the rental of my house?" "We knew you were away, but we didn't fully understand the implications of military deployment." This was not an apology, Marcus realized. This was the HOA board trying to blame the property management company while pretending they had not known what they were doing. Board member Richard Thompson spoke up. "Sergeant, we've contacted Sunset Property Management and worked out an agreement. The lease will be canceled immediately. The Morrison family will get their full deposit back, and you can have your house back by the end of the week. What about the rental income that was collected from my house? The management company has agreed to return all rental payments to the HOA, and the HOA will use that money to compensate you for any damages or inconvenience." Marcus looked at Tony Rodriguez, who was listening with a skeptical expression. "Mrs. Wells, what about the monitoring fees you claimed I owed? What about the policies that were supposedly violated? We've reviewed your case and determined that the monitoring fees were incorrectly applied. Your property was never actually in violation of any policies, so they were admitting that the entire justification for stealing his house had been made up." Marcus felt his anger rising, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Mrs. Wells, I want everything in writing. I want a formal apology from the HOA acknowledging that my house was illegally rented without permission. I want confirmation that all HOA dues and fees are current, and that no additional fees will be charged. And I want a guarantee that this will never happen to another military family." Patricia Wells looked around at the other board members, who all nodded reluctantly. "We can provide those assurances, Sergeant Chen." "By when?" "By this afternoon. Our lawyer is preparing all the paperwork now." Marcus stood up to leave. "Mrs. Wells, you have until 5 o'clock today to deliver everything I requested. If you don't, my fellow soldiers and I will resume our educational program tomorrow morning." Outside, the soldiers were waiting patiently while news reporters interviewed neighbors. Mrs. Rodriguez was speaking to a camera crew, explaining how the HOA had stolen Marcus's house while he was serving overseas. Her story was passionate and detailed, and she was clearly angry about how a soldier had been treated by his own community. As Marcus emerged from Patricia Wells's house, the reporters surrounded him wanting updates on the situation. "Sergeant Chen, has the HOA agreed to return your house? They've agreed to correct their mistake and return my property. We should have everything resolved by this evening. How do you feel about the way this situation was handled? I'm disappointed that it took national media attention and 23 soldiers to get the HOA to do the right thing. Military families deserve better treatment from the communities they're protecting. What message do you have for other military families who might face similar situations?" Marcus looked at the cameras and thought about all the military families who had contacted him since the story broke. "My message is that soldiers don't fight alone. we take care of each other, and we don't give up when the fight gets difficult. If your community tries to take advantage of you while you're deployed, reach out to your fellow veterans and active duty soldiers. We'll stand with you. That afternoon, Patricia Wells delivered the paperwork as promised. The HOA formally apologized for the administrative error that led to the unauthorized rental of Marcus's house. All fees were waived, all rental income was returned to Marcus as compensation, and the HOA adopted new policies specifically protecting deployed military personnel from similar actions. More importantly, the Morrison family received their full deposit back from the property management company, plus an additional payment to help with their moving expenses. Marcus had insisted on this provision, knowing that the family were victims too. The story did not end with just Marcus getting his house back. Within a week, the story had prompted a federal investigation into HOA practices regarding military families. Congressman David Miller introduced legislation called the Military Family Protection Act, which would make it illegal for HOAs to take action against properties owned by deployed service members. 3 of the 5 HOA board members resigned in disgrace after the national attention exposed other questionable decisions they had made over the years. Patricia Wells tried to stay on as president, but the homeowners voted her out at the next election. Mrs. Rodriguez was elected as the new HOA president, with a promise to treat all residents fairly and respectfully. The property management company lost several major contracts as other HOAs distanced themselves from the negative publicity. Robert Harrison eventually sold the company and left the property management business entirely. Marcus returned to complete his deployment knowing that his house was secure and waiting for him. But more than that, he returned knowing that his story had helped protect other military families from similar abuse. The legislation prompted by his case was signed into law 6 months later, giving deployed service members specific legal protections against HOA overreach. When Marcus finally came home for good, he found his house exactly as he had left it. Mrs. Rodriguez had organized the neighbors to clean and prepare it for his return. There were welcome home signs in several yards, and the Johnsons had planted a small American flag garden next to his driveway. The Morrison family had found a new house in a different neighborhood and were doing well. Sarah Morrison sent Marcus a Christmas card every year, thanking him for helping them get their deposit back when they needed it most. Marcus decided to stay in Sunset Hills after all. The community had shown its true character when tested, and most of his neighbors had supported him against the... By noon, the soldiers had visited all 5 HOA board members. At each house, the same scene played out. Uniformed soldiers asking polite questions, nervous board members making excuses, and neighbors gathering to watch and learn what had really happened to Marcus's house. The story was spreading beyond the neighborhood. Someone had posted pictures on social media showing 23 soldiers in dress uniforms standing at attention outside Patricia Wells's house. The caption read, "Local HOA steals deployed soldier's house. His unit comes to ask questions." The post was being shared hundreds of times. By early afternoon, a local news reporter had arrived in the neighborhood. Channel 7 News had received multiple tips about the story and sent a crew to investigate. When the reporter saw the soldiers maintaining their respectful vigil outside the HOA president's house, she knew this was going to be a big story. The reporter approached Marcus while the other soldiers continued their patient wait. "Sergeant Chen, I'm Jennifer Walsh from Channel 7 News. Can you tell me what's happening here today?" Marcus looked at Tony Rodriguez, who nodded permission to speak with the media. "Ma'am, I'm a deployed soldier whose house was stolen by the HOA while I was serving overseas. These soldiers are my brothers in arms, and they're helping me understand how civilian community organizations operate when military families are away serving their country. Can you explain what you mean by stolen?" "While I was deployed, the HOA changed their policies and then claimed my house was abandoned because I didn't attend meetings or pay monitoring fees that didn't exist when I left. They rented my house to strangers without my permission and kept the rental money." The reporter's eyes widened. This was exactly the kind of story that made people angry and got attention. "You were deployed overseas when this happened?" "Yes, ma'am. I was serving my country in a combat zone when the HOA decided to steal my house and rent it out. Have you tried to resolve this through legal channels?" "Yes, ma'am, but the courts move slowly and I only have 2 weeks of leave. My lawyer says it could take months to get my house back through the legal system." "So you brought your fellow soldiers to help?" "Ma'am, These soldiers volunteered their own leave time to come here and learn about how HOA policies work. They're very interested in understanding how military families are treated by civilian organizations. The reporter interviewed several of the soldiers, and each one gave similar answers. They were there to support their brother and to learn about civilian community organizations. They were polite, professional, and completely reasonable. They were also clearly not going anywhere until the situation was resolved. The reporter then tried to interview Patricia Wells. When she knocked on the door, Patricia Wells answered but immediately became hostile when she saw the news camera. "I have no comment." "This is harassment! These people are trying to intimidate me." "Mrs. Wells, can you explain the HOA's policy regarding deployed military personnel?" "No comment. Call our lawyers." Patricia Wells slammed the door again, but not before the camera caught her looking guilty and defensive. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the story was on the Channel 7 website with the headline, "HOA accused of stealing deployed soldiers' home." The story included interviews with Marcus and his fellow soldiers, along with Patricia Wells refusing to comment and slamming her door. The story was picked up by other news outlets within hours. Soon it was trending on social media with hashtags like #StolenHouse and #SupportOurTroops. People across the country were reading about Marcus's situation and expressing outrage that military families could be treated this way. At 4 o'clock, 3 more HOA board members arrived at Patricia Wells's house for an emergency meeting. The soldiers watched as nervous-looking civilians hurried inside, trying to avoid making eye contact with the uniformed men waiting patiently on the sidewalk. Tony Rodriguez gathered the soldiers for a quick briefing. "People, Phase 1 of our educational mission has been successful. The community leaders are now aware that their policies have attracted attention from concerned citizens. Phase 2 begins now." "What's Phase 2, Sergeant?" asked Corporal Jake Sullivan. "Phase 2 is when we expand our educational outreach to include the property management company that helped execute this theft." The soldiers drove in convoy to the offices of Sunset Property Management. It was a small office in a strip mall, the kind of place that managed rental properties for people who did not want to deal with tenants directly. When 23 soldiers in dress uniforms walked through the front door, the receptionist looked like she might faint. "Good afternoon," Marcus said politely. "I'm Staff Sergeant Chen. I'd like to speak with Jennifer about the unauthorized rental of my property." Let me... Just a moment, please." The receptionist disappeared into the back office. Marcus could hear excited whispers and phone calls being made. After 10 minutes, a man in an expensive suit came out to speak with them. "Gentlemen, I'm Robert Harrison, the owner of this company. I understand there's some kind of dispute about a rental property. Mr. Harrison, your company rented my house without my permission while I was deployed overseas. I'd like an explanation of how that happened." "Sir, we have a signed agreement with the HOA authorizing us to manage the property. All our actions were legal and proper." Staff Sergeant Santos stepped forward. "Mr. Harrison, were you aware that the homeowner was deployed with the military when you rented his house?" The circumstances of the homeowner were not relevant to our agreement with the HOA. "So you're saying that military service is not relevant when stealing a soldier's house?" Tony Rodriguez asked. Robert Harrison's confidence was starting to crack. He looked around at all the soldiers staring at him with polite but intense expressions. "Gentlemen, this is a civil matter between the homeowner and the HOA. We were simply executing a management agreement." "Mr. Harrison," Marcus said, "I want the lease canceled immediately and I want the Morrison family's deposit returned to them so they can find other housing." "I can't just cancel a lease. There are legal procedures that must be followed." "Mr. Harrison," Tony Rodriguez said, "these soldiers have 2 weeks of leave to learn about property management procedures. We're very patient students." Robert Harrison understood the implied threat. 23 soldiers were prepared to make his life very difficult until this situation was resolved. "Let me make some phone calls," he said, and disappeared into his office. While they waited at the property management office, Marcus received a call from Mrs. Rodriguez. "Marcus, honey, you need to know that Patricia Wells has been calling all the neighbors, trying to get them to complain about the soldiers. But it's not working. Everyone knows what she did to you was wrong. How are the neighbors reacting? Most of them are supporting you." Mrs. Johnson brought coffee and donuts to the soldiers at Patricia's house. The Martinez family put up a sign in their yard that says, "Support our troops." Even old Mr. Peterson, who never talks to anyone, told me that what the HOA did was disgraceful. Marcus felt a warm feeling in his chest. His neighbors were standing with him against the HOA board that was supposed to represent them. Mrs. Rodriguez, what about the Morrison family? How are they handling all this attention? Sarah Morrison came over this morning. She's grateful that you're trying to get their deposit back, so they can move without losing their money. She feels terrible about living in your house, but she's also scared about where her family will go. Tell her not to worry. We're going to make sure they're taken care of. At 6 o'clock, Robert Harrison emerged from his office looking defeated. Sergeant Chen, I've spoken with our lawyers and the HOA board. We're prepared to discuss a resolution to this situation. I'm listening. We can cancel the lease if the HOA agrees to reimburse us for lost rental income. We can also return the Morrison family's deposit if they agree to vacate within 30 days. What about the rental income you've already collected from my house? That would need to be worked out with the HOA. Marcus looked at Tony Rodriguez, who nodded slightly. Mr. Harrison, you have 24 hours to work out the details with the HOA. If this isn't resolved by tomorrow evening, we'll be back to continue our educational program. Robert Harrison nodded quickly. 24 hours. I understand. As the soldiers left the property management office, Marcus felt something he had not felt in months. Hope. The system that had failed him was finally starting to respond. The people who had stolen his house were discovering that soldiers did not give up easily, and they did not fight alone. The local news story had already been picked up by national outlets. By evening, Marcus's story was being discussed on cable news programs and shared millions of times on social media. The phrase HOA steals soldiers' house was trending nationwide. But more importantly, Patricia Wells and the HOA board were learning that their actions had consequences. They had thought they could abuse a deployed soldier because he was thousands of miles away and powerless to stop them. They had not counted on him having 22 brothers in arms who were willing to spend their leave time seeking justice. Tomorrow would bring the final resolution, one way or another. Saturday morning came with perfect weather. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and it was the kind of day when suburban families typically slept in late and made pancakes for breakfast. But at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, 23 United States Army soldiers were already awake, dressed in their formal dress blue uniforms, and gathering in the hotel parking lot. Marcus had spent most of the night planning their route through the neighborhood. He had addresses for all 5 HOA board members, plus the property management company office. The plan was simple: visit each location, introduce themselves politely, and ask for explanations about HOA policies and procedures. They would be completely legal, completely respectful, and completely intimidating. Tony Rodriguez called everyone together for a final briefing. Listen up, people. Today we conduct Operation Reclaim. Our mission is to educate ourselves about civilian community organizations and to have productive conversations with community leaders. We will conduct ourselves with the highest standards of military professionalism. Rules of engagement, Tony continued. We are citizens asking questions of our representatives. We are not threatening anyone. We are not breaking any laws. We are not entering any property without permission. We are simply exercising our rights as Americans to petition our government and ask questions of people in authority. Specialist David Kim raised his hand. Sergeant, what if they refuse to talk to us? Kim, that's their right. But we also have the right to wait on public property until they change their minds. Patience is a military virtue. The soldiers climbed into their rental cars and drove in a convoy toward Sunset Hills. 23 military vehicles driving through a quiet suburban neighborhood at 6:30 in the morning was not something the residents were used to seeing. Curtains moved in windows as people looked out to see what was happening. The first stop was Patricia Wells' house. It was just as perfect as Marcus remembered, with flowers arranged like they were posing for a magazine photo. The soldiers parked their cars on the street and gathered on the sidewalk in front of her house. Marcus walked up to the front door and rang the doorbell. Tony Rodriguez and Jake Sullivan flanked him on either side. The other 20 soldiers stood at attention on the sidewalk, forming 2 neat rows like an honor guard. It took several minutes before Patricia Wells answered the door. When she opened it and saw 23 soldiers in dress uniforms standing in front of her house, her face went completely white. Mrs. Wells, good morning. I'm Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen. I believe you know who I am. Patricia Wells looked like she wanted to slam the door and run away, but she was trapped by the sight of so many soldiers standing respectfully on her property. Mr. Sergeant Chen, what are you doing here? Why are all these people with you? Mrs. Wells, these are my fellow soldiers. They're here on a cultural exchange program to learn about how American community organizations work. They're very interested in understanding HOA policies and procedures. You can't just show up at my house with an army. Tony Rodriguez stepped forward. Ma'am, we're not an army. We're individual citizens exercising our right to speak with our community representatives. We were hoping you could explain some of your association's policies to us. I don't have to explain anything to you people. This is harassment. Marcus spoke calmly. Mrs. Wells, we're just asking for information. For example, could you explain the policy that allows the HOA to rent out homes belonging to deployed soldiers? That's confidential HOA business. You need to speak with our lawyers. Mrs. Wells, said Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, we're also interested in learning about the notification procedures for policy changes. How do you notify homeowners about new rules when they're serving overseas? Patricia Wells looked around at all the soldiers staring at her with polite, professional expressions. Each one of them looked like they were ready to wait all day for answers to their questions. I'm calling the police, she announced and slammed the door. That's her right, Tony Rodriguez said calmly. We'll wait here until she's ready to continue our educational discussion. 10 minutes later, 2 police cars arrived. The officers got out and approached the soldiers with cautious expressions. They had probably never been called to deal with a complaint about uniformed military personnel conducting themselves politely on a public sidewalk. The lead officer was a middle-aged sergeant named Murphy. Good morning. I'm Sergeant Murphy with Metro Police. We got a complaint about harassment. Marcus stepped forward. Good morning, Sergeant Murphy. I'm Staff Sergeant Chen, U.S. Army. These soldiers are with me for a cultural exchange program. We're learning about civilian community organizations. Sir, the homeowner says you're harassing her. Sergeant Murphy, we're standing on a public sidewalk asking questions of an elected community representative. We haven't threatened anyone, we haven't trespassed on any property, and we haven't broken any laws. Sergeant Murphy looked around at the soldiers. They were standing at attention, properly dressed, and behaving with perfect military discipline. There was absolutely nothing illegal about their presence. What exactly are you trying to accomplish here? Sergeant, I'm a deployed soldier whose house was stolen by this HOA while I was serving overseas. These soldiers are helping me understand how that was possible under the association's policies. Sergeant Murphy's expression changed immediately. Like most police officers, he supported the military and understood what deployment meant. Your house was stolen while you were deployed? Yes, sir. The HOA claims I violated policies that were created after I left for overseas duty. They rented my house to strangers without my permission while I was serving my country. Sergeant Murphy walked over to Patricia Wells's front door and knocked. When she answered, he spoke to her quietly for several minutes. Marcus could not hear the conversation, but he could see Patricia Wells becoming more and more agitated. When Sergeant Murphy returned, he looked frustrated. Sergeant Chen, Mrs. Wells says this is a civil matter between you and the HOA. She doesn't want to discuss it with you or your soldiers. That's her right, Sergeant Murphy. We'll just wait here until she changes her mind. How long are you planning to wait? Tony Rodriguez answered. Sergeant, we're on 2 weeks of leave. We've got plenty of time to learn about community organizations. Sergeant Murphy understood immediately. 23 soldiers were going to stand on this public sidewalk for as long as it took to get answers. There was nothing illegal about it, but it was going to make Patricia Wells very uncomfortable. Mrs. Wells, Sergeant Murphy called toward the house. These soldiers have every right to be on this public sidewalk. If you don't want to talk to them, that's your choice. But they're not breaking any laws by waiting here. Patricia Wells slammed her door again. The soldiers waited. They stood at attention in perfect formation, not moving, not talking, just waiting. Neighbors started coming outside to see what was happening. Some of them recognized Marcus and realized this was about his stolen house. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived and started talking to the neighbors, explaining Marcus's situation. Within an hour, several neighbors were bringing the soldiers bottles of water and expressing support for Marcus. The story of the deployed soldier whose house was stolen was spreading through the neighborhood. At 10 o'clock, Patricia Wells opened her door again. Fine. What do you want to know? Marcus stepped forward. Mrs. Wells, we want to understand the HOA policy that allowed you to rent my house without my permission while I was deployed overseas. The policy states that homes left vacant for more than 60 days without proper notification and monitoring fees are considered abandoned and can be rented to recover unpaid fees. Mrs. Wells, I sent you written notification of my deployment before I left. I provided contact information and arranged for property maintenance. How was my house considered abandoned? The notification you sent didn't follow the new procedures that were implemented after you left. Staff Sergeant Santos asked, how were homeowners notified of these new procedures? The changes were announced at the monthly meeting and posted on the community website. Mrs. Wells, Marcus said, I was already deployed when that meeting occurred. I was serving my country overseas. How was I supposed to attend a meeting or check a website from a combat zone? Patricia Wells looked around at all the soldiers staring at her. She was beginning to realize how her actions looked to people who had actually served their country. That's not the HOA's responsibility. Homeowners are responsible for staying informed about policy changes regardless of their personal circumstances. Tony Rodriguez spoke for the first time since the police left. Ma'am, are you saying that military deployment is a personal circumstance that doesn't excuse a soldier from attending neighborhood meetings? The HOA has to follow its policies equally for everyone. Mrs. Wells, Marcus said, I want my house back. The lease you authorized was fraudulent and you know it. I can't just cancel a lease. The tenants have rights. Then you're going to figure out how to fix this mess you created. Because we're going to be here learning about your policies until you do. Patricia Wells looked at the 23 soldiers who were clearly prepared to wait as long as necessary. She was beginning to understand that this problem was not going away, Kia. Marcus stepped off the plane at the airport feeling like a stranger in his own country. After 7 months in a desert where everything was brown and dusty, the green grass and blue sky of home looked almost fake. The airport was full of families hugging returning travelers, business people rushing to catch flights, and normal people living normal lives. Nobody looked at Marcus and thought about the house that had been stolen from him while he served overseas. Mrs. Rodriguez was waiting for him at baggage claim. She looked smaller and older than he remembered, but her smile was exactly the same. She hugged him tight like he was her own grandson coming home from war. Marcus, honey, it's so good to see you safe. I've been worried about you every single day. Thank you for everything you've done. Mrs. Rodriguez, I know this hasn't been easy for you either. During the drive through his old neighborhood, Marcus felt his heart sink. Everything looked the same as when he left, except for one terrible detail. There were cars in his driveway that did not belong to him. There were children's toys in his front yard. There were different curtains in his windows. Have you talked to the Morrison family recently? Marcus asked. Sarah Morrison came over to my house last week. She's still very upset about the whole situation. She knows it's wrong, but she doesn't know what to do. Her husband lost his job last month, so they really can't afford to move out and lose their deposit money. Marcus felt sorry for the Morrison family, but he also felt angry that their problems were being solved by stealing his house. What about the HOA board? Have you seen Patricia Wells around? Oh, she's been very busy lately. Lots of cars at her house, lots of meetings. I think they know something is coming. Mr. Johnson told me that Patricia asked him if he knew when you were coming home. She's nervous. Good. Mrs. Rodriguez pulled into her driveway. Marcus, where are you planning to stay while you're here? You know, you're welcome to use my guest room. Thank you, but I won't be staying long in any one place. I have some friends coming to visit and we'll probably be moving around a lot. How many friends? 23? Mrs. Rodriguez whistled softly. 23 soldiers. Yes, ma'am. They're very interested in learning about how neighborhood associations work. Marcus, honey, you be careful. I know you're angry and you have every right to be angry, but don't do anything that will get you in trouble with the law. Mrs. Rodriguez, we're not going to break any laws. We're just going to have some conversations with people. Very polite, very respectful conversations. That evening, Marcus walked slowly around his neighborhood. Everything was exactly as he remembered, except for the feeling that he no longer belonged there. He had bought his house because he wanted to be part of a community, but now that community had turned against him. The people he had trusted to protect his property had stolen it instead. He stopped across the street from his house and looked at it for a long time. Through the living room window, he could see the Morrison family eating dinner together. The children were young, maybe 6 and 8 years old. They looked happy and safe in what they thought was their home. Marcus did not blame the Morrison family. They were victims too. But seeing strangers living in his house, eating in his kitchen, sleeping in his bedroom, made him feel sick and angry and sad all at the same time. As he stood there, a car pulled into the driveway. A man got out and walked toward the front door. This had to be Tom Morrison, the father. He looked tired and worried, like someone carrying too much stress. When he saw Marcus standing across the street, he stopped and waved. Marcus waved back. For a moment, the two men just looked at each other across the street. Here was the soldier who owned the house, and here was the man who was living in it illegally. Both of them were victims of the same fraud, but they were on opposite sides of the problem. Tom Morrison walked across the street. "Are you Marcus Chen?" "Yes, I am. I'm Tom Morrison. I want you to know how sorry I am about this whole situation. If I had known the truth when we signed the lease, we never would have moved in. I believe you, Mr. Morrison. You and your family aren't the bad guys here. My wife has been crying about this for weeks. She feels terrible that we're living in a soldier's house while he's deployed. But we can't afford to just move out. We paid $3,000 up front, and we sold our old house to move here." Marcus understood. The Morrison family was trapped just like he was trapped. The only difference was that they were trapped inside his house while he was trapped outside of it. "Mr. Morrison, I'm not angry at you or your family. I'm angry at the people who created this mess. But I am going to get my house back. I understand. Sarah and I have been looking for another place to live. But everything costs more than we can afford right now. And the property management company says if we break the lease, we lose all our deposit money. How much time do you need?" Tom Morrison looked surprised by the question. "Time? If I can get the lease canceled and get your deposit money back, how much time would you need to find another place?" I don't know. Maybe a month? 6 weeks? But how could you get our deposit back? The property management company says they'll keep it if we break the lease. Mr. Morrison, let me worry about the property management company. You just worry about finding a new place for your family. That night, Marcus called Tony Rodriguez to confirm that the other soldiers were still planning to visit. Chen were locked and loaded. Everyone's leave got approved, and we'll start arriving tomorrow. You ready for this? I'm ready, Sergeant. But I want to make sure everyone understands the plan. We're not here to hurt anyone or break any laws. We're here to have educational conversations with community leaders. Roger that. Educational conversations. Got it. And Tony? The family living in my house, they're not the enemy. They're victims too. I want to help them get out of this mess, not make their lives worse. Copy that, Chen. We'll be respectful to the family. But the HOA board? They're going to get the full educational experience. Marcus spent the next day driving around his old neighborhood, looking at every house, every street, every detail. He was memorizing it all because he did not know if he would ever live here again. Even if he got his house back, would he want to stay in a community that had treated him this way? He also drove past Patricia Wells' house. It was exactly as he remembered. Perfect lawn, perfect flowers, perfect paint job. It looked like the house of someone who had never had any real problems in her life. Tomorrow, Patricia Wells was going to meet some people who had spent months facing real problems in a place where real bullets flew. That evening, the first group of soldiers started arriving in town. Marcus had arranged to meet them at a hotel near the airport. One by one, his brothers in arms checked in and gathered in the hotel lobby. These were soldiers who had volunteered their leave time to help a fellow soldier fight for his home. By 10 o'clock that night, 23 soldiers were sitting in the hotel conference room, listening to Marcus explain the situation in detail. He showed them pictures of his house, pictures of the rental signs, and copies of all the paperwork from the HOA and property management company. Tony Rodriguez stood up when Marcus finished talking. All right, people, here's how this is going to work. Tomorrow morning, we're going to start our educational program about civilian community organizations. We're going to visit the homes of HOA board members and ask them to explain their policies and procedures. We're going to be polite, respectful, and professional at all times. Corporal Jake Sullivan raised his hand. Sergeant, what if they don't want to talk to us? Jake, these are community leaders. They're supposed to be available to discuss community issues with residents and concerned citizens. If they're too busy to talk, we'll wait patiently until they have time. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos asked, what if they call the police? Santos, we're not breaking any laws. We're just citizens asking questions of our elected representatives. The police might show up, but they'll see that we're conducting ourselves appropriately. Marcus looked around the room at all the faces of soldiers who were willing to spend their leave time helping him. I want everyone to understand something. Tomorrow we start getting my house back. But more than that, we start showing these people that they can't steal from soldiers and get away with it. The soldiers nodded. They were ready for battle. But this time the battlefield was an American suburb, and the enemy was a group of civilians who thought they could abuse military families without consequences. Tomorrow, the HOA board was going to learn what happened when soldiers took care of their own. Marcus had always been taught to handle his problems alone. In the military, soldiers were expected to be tough and independent. But this problem was bigger than anything one person could handle. The HOA had lawyers, the property management company had contracts, and the tenants had legal rights. Marcus had justice on his side, but justice without power was just a nice idea. The first person Marcus told was his bunkmate, Corporal Jake Sullivan. Jake was from Texas and had a way of making everything sound simple, even when it was complicated. They had served together for 2 years, and Jake was the kind of friend who would lend you money without asking when you would pay it back. So let me get this straight, Jake said after Marcus explained the whole story. You're over here getting shot at by bad guys, and back home some old lady in a neighborhood committee is stealing your house? That's about right. And the cops won't help because the thieves have paperwork? The police say it's a civil matter. They can't remove tenants who have a lease, even if the lease was created illegally. Jake shook his head. Man, that's messed up. What are you going to do? I don't know. The lawyers say it could take months to get my house back. I might come home from deployment and have nowhere to live. That ain't right, Marcus. We're over here serving our country and they're stealing from us back home. There's got to be something we can do. Word spread quickly through the unit. Soldiers talk to each other, especially when one of their own is being treated unfairly. Within 2 days, everyone in Marcus's platoon knew about his situation. Most of them were angry about it. Sergeant First Class Tony Rodriguez was the platoon sergeant. He was a career soldier who had served 3 deployments and planned to retire in 5 years. Tony was respected by everyone in the unit because he took care of his soldiers like they were his own sons. Tony pulled Marcus aside after evening chow. Chen, I heard about your house situation. That's some real bull right there. Yes, Sergeant. I'm trying to handle it through legal channels, but it's going to take time I don't have. Legal channels, Tony spit in the dirt. Legal channels are for people who have time to waste. You know what's not legal? Stealing from soldiers while they're deployed. You know what else isn't legal? Fraud. I know, Sergeant, but proving it in court takes months. Tony was quiet for a moment, thinking. Chen, when are you going on leave? I've got 2 weeks scheduled next month. I was planning to go home and try to sort this mess out in person. Good. And I suppose you'll want to see your house while you're there? Of course, Sergeant. It's my house. Damn right it's your house. And I suppose you might want some friends to come visit you while you're on leave? Marcus looked at Tony carefully. There was something in the sergeant's voice that suggested he was not just making conversation. I suppose I might want some visitors. Yes. Well, it just so happens that half this platoon has leave scheduled around the same time. Funny how that works out sometimes. We were thinking about taking a trip to see how American neighborhoods work. You know, cultural exchange and all that. Marcus began to understand what Tony was suggesting. A cultural exchange? Sure. We're always hearing about American suburbs and homeowner associations. Might be educational to see how they operate. Especially when they're dealing with military families. That does sound educational, Sergeant. Of course, we'd want to look professional. Represent the United States Army properly. Might want to wear our dress uniforms. Show these civilians what real soldiers look like. The conversation was becoming clearer. Tony was suggesting that Marcus's platoon could visit his neighborhood while he was on leave. Not to cause trouble, but to educate themselves about civilian life. If their presence happened to make the HOA board uncomfortable, well, that would just be a side effect of their educational mission. That evening, Marcus called Mrs. Rodriguez to tell her he would be coming home on leave next month. Oh, Marcus, that's wonderful. But honey, what are you going to do about your house? Where will you stay? I'm working on that, Mrs. Rodriguez. I might have some friends visiting with me. Military friends. How many friends? Marcus did a quick count of the soldiers who had volunteered to take leave at the same time. About 20 or so. There was silence on the other end of the phone. 20 soldiers? They want to see how American neighborhoods work. It's a cultural exchange program. Mrs. Rodriguez understood immediately. She had lived through enough neighborhood drama to recognize what was really happening. Marcus, these soldiers, they'll be respectful, right? I don't want any trouble in the neighborhood. Mrs. Rodriguez, these are United States Army soldiers. They'll be the most respectful people you've ever met. They just want to learn about civilian life and maybe meet some of the community leaders. Community leaders like the HOA board? Especially the HOA board. I'm sure they'll be very interested in learning how neighborhood associations work. Mrs. Rodriguez chuckled. Marcus, honey, I think your friends are going to get a very good education about homeowner associations. Over the next week, more soldiers volunteered to join Marcus's cultural exchange program. Word had spread beyond his platoon to other units. Soldiers who barely knew Marcus were asking if they could help. The story had struck a nerve with everyone who heard it. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos from the motor pool unit was the first to volunteer from outside Marcus's platoon. Chen, I heard about your house situation. My mom has been fighting with her HOA for 2 years over the color she painted her front door. These HOA people think they're little dictators. Santos, you don't have to get involved in this. It's my problem. Like hell it is. When someone steals from one soldier, they're stealing from all of us. Besides, I've always wanted to meet one of those HOA board members in person. I have some questions about how they operate. Specialist David Kim from Communications also wanted to help. My family immigrated to America so we could own property freely. The idea that some neighborhood committee can steal your house while you're serving overseas? That's not the America my parents came here for. Even soldiers from other companies started asking about Marcus's situation. The story had become bigger than just one stolen house. It had become a symbol of how military families were being treated by the people they were protecting. Captain Jennifer Walsh was the company commander. She called Marcus into her office to discuss his leave plans. Sergeant Chen, I understand you're planning some kind of group leave activity? Yes, ma'am. Cultural exchange. Some of the soldiers want to learn about civilian community organizations. Captain Walsh smiled slightly. Cultural exchange, I see. And this cultural exchange will involve visiting your neighborhood? Yes, ma'am. The soldiers are very interested in seeing how homeowner associations operate. Sergeant, I want to be very clear about something. Any activities conducted by soldiers on leave must be completely legal and appropriate. Is that understood? Absolutely, ma'am. We're just going to observe and learn. Good. Because if any soldiers were to engage in illegal or inappropriate behavior, that would reflect poorly on the entire unit. Ma'am, these soldiers are professionals. They know how to conduct themselves properly. I'm sure they do, Sergeant. In fact, I'm so confident in their professionalism that I've decided to approve leave for all the soldiers who requested it. We wouldn't want to interfere with such an important cultural exchange program. Marcus realized that Captain Walsh understood exactly what was being planned, and she was giving it her unofficial approval. The entire chain of command was behind him, even if they could not say so officially. By the end of the week, 23 soldiers had volunteered for Marcus's cultural exchange program. They came from different units and different backgrounds. But they all had one thing in common. They believed that stealing from deployed soldiers was wrong, and they wanted to do something about it. Tony Rodriguez gathered all the volunteers for a planning meeting. Listen up, people. We're going to visit Chen's neighborhood to learn about how civilian communities work. We're going to be respectful, professional, and educational. We're not going to break any laws or threaten anyone. We're just going to have some conversations with community leaders about their policies and procedures. Corporal Jake Sullivan raised his hand. Sergeant, what if these community leaders don't want to have educational conversations with us? Well, Jake, part of being a community leader is being available to answer questions from concerned citizens. If they're too busy to talk, we'll just wait patiently until they have time. After all, we've got 2 weeks of leave. Marcus looked around at the faces of his fellow soldiers. These were people who had volunteered to serve their country, and now they were volunteering to help him fight for his home. For the first time since this nightmare began, Marcus felt like he was not alone. The HOA board had no idea what was coming their way. Marcus spent the next week trying to fix the problem through proper channels. He barely slept, staying up late into the night making phone calls and sending emails. The time difference between his deployment location and home meant he was calling people at strange hours, but he did not care. His house was being stolen and he needed answers. Patricia Wells finally returned his call on Friday afternoon. She sounded annoyed that he was bothering her. Mr. Chen, I understand you're upset, but the HOA board had to take action. Your property was in violation of multiple neighborhood policies. What violations? I've never received any notices. I've never broken any rules. I pay my dues on time every month. Mr. Chen, last year the HOA updated our policies regarding extended absences. Any homeowner who is away for more than 60 days must submit a detailed absence plan and pay additional fees for property monitoring. You failed to do either of those things. Marcus felt his anger building. He forced himself to speak calmly. Mrs. Wells, I sent you a letter before I deployed. I told you exactly when I was leaving and when I would return. I gave you my contact information and my neighbor's contact information. I followed every rule I knew about. That letter only covered the old policies. Mr. Chen, the new policies require a formal absence plan form, a property inspection, and monthly monitoring fees of $200. Since you didn't comply, your property was considered abandoned. The board voted to rent it out to recover the unpaid monitoring fees. You never told me about any new policies. I never received any forms or notices about monitoring fees. The new policies were announced at the monthly HOA meeting in March. All homeowners were required to attend or send a representative. Since you didn't attend, you're considered to have waived your right to object to policy changes. Marcus wanted to throw his phone across the room. He had been deployed since February. There was no way he could have attended a meeting in March. There was no way he could have known about policy changes that happened after he left. Mrs. Wells, I was already deployed in March. I was serving my country overseas. I couldn't attend your meeting because I was thousands of miles away doing my military duty. That's unfortunate. Mr. Chen, but military service doesn't excuse homeowners from their HOA responsibilities. If you can't fulfill your obligations, perhaps you shouldn't own property in our community. The line went quiet. Marcus could not believe what he had just heard. This woman was telling him that serving his country was not a good enough excuse for missing HOA meetings. She was treating his military deployment like it was a vacation he had chosen to take. Mrs. Wells, what you've done is illegal. I'm going to fight this with every resource I have. Mr. Chen, you're welcome to try, but the HOA has full legal authority to manage properties in violation of community standards. Our lawyers assure us that everything we've done is completely legal. If you don't like our policies, you can sell your house and move somewhere else. She hung up on him. Marcus immediately called his lawyer again. The lawyer had been researching the situation and had some information, but none of it was good news. Marcus, I've looked into this HOA's new policies. They're legally questionable, but not clearly illegal. The HOA does have broad authority to create and enforce rules. The problem is that challenging their actions will take time. How much time? If we file immediately, we might get a hearing in 6 to 8 weeks. Then there will be discovery, depositions, and multiple court appearances. If the case goes to trial, we're looking at 6 months minimum, and that's assuming everything goes smoothly. I come home from deployment in 8 weeks. Are you telling me I might not have my house back when I return from serving my country? It's possible, Marcus. I'm sorry. The legal system moves slowly, especially in property disputes. The HOA knows this and they're counting on you giving up. What about the family living in my house? Can't we at least get them removed? That's complicated too. They signed what appears to be a valid lease. They paid money in good faith. The courts will be reluctant to make them homeless, especially if they have children. Even if we prove the HOA acted wrongly, the tenants have rights. Marcus felt trapped. The people who were supposed to protect his property had stolen it. The legal system that was supposed to provide justice was too slow to help him. The tenants living in his house were innocent victims who would be hurt no matter what happened. He decided to try a different approach. Maybe he could reason with the tenants directly. If he explained the situation, maybe they would agree to move out voluntarily. Mrs. Rodriguez had mentioned that the woman seemed nice when they talked. Marcus asked Mrs. Rodriguez to knock on his door and asked to speak with the renters. An hour later, she called him back with a report. Marcus, I talked to the woman, Sarah Morrison. She's very sweet and she feels terrible about the situation. She had no idea there was anything wrong with the rental. But Marcus, they can't just move out. Why not? They sold their old house to move here. They paid $3,000 in deposits and first month's rent. Their children are already enrolled in the local schools. Sarah's husband just started a new job nearby. They have nowhere else to go and they can't afford to lose the money they already paid. Marcus understood. The Morrison family were victims too. They had made major life decisions based on what they thought was a legal rental agreement. Moving out would destroy their lives just like the HOA had destroyed his. Did you tell her I'm deployed overseas? Yes, and she started crying. She said she never would have rented the house if she knew it belonged to a soldier who was serving overseas. She asked me to tell you how sorry she is. But Marcus, she also said they signed a 1-year lease. They can't break it without losing everything they've paid. That evening, Marcus called the property management company again. Maybe they would be reasonable once they understood the full situation. Jennifer, this is Marcus Chen again. I need you to cancel the lease on my house immediately. The HOA had no authority to rent my property. Mr. Chen, as I explained before, we have a signed agreement with the HOA board. Our legal department has reviewed everything and confirmed that we're operating within the law. We can't just cancel a lease because you're unhappy. The HOA never told me about their new policies. I was deployed overseas when they changed the rules. This is fraud. Sir, the HOA provided us with documentation showing that all homeowners were properly notified of the policy changes. If you have a dispute with the HOA, that's between you and them. We're just managing the property according to our agreement. What documentation? I never received any notifications. According to our files, policy change notices were mailed to all homeowners and also posted on the community website. Failure to receive or read official notices doesn't invalidate the policies. Marcus realized he was fighting a system designed to protect itself, not individual homeowners. The HOA claimed they had followed proper procedures. The property management company was hiding behind their contract with the HOA. The tenants were protected by lease agreements they had signed in good faith. Everyone had covered themselves legally while destroying his life. He tried one more approach. Maybe his military command could help. Surely there were protections for deployed service members who were being mistreated at home. Marcus explained the situation to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Williams. The colonel listened carefully and then made some phone calls to the legal assistance office. 2 days later, Colonel Williams called Marcus into his office. Chen, I've got some information for you, but you're not going to like it. Military legal assistance confirms that HOAs have broad authority to create and enforce rules. The Service Members Civil Relief Act provides some protections, but mainly for things like court proceedings and lease terminations. It doesn't prevent HOAs from taking action against properties they consider abandoned. Sir, my property wasn't abandoned. I was deployed. There's a difference. I agree, Sergeant, but the law doesn't always make that distinction clearly. The Legal Assistance Office says your best bet is still civilian court, and that could take months. So there's nothing the military can do to help? Not through official channels, no. But Chen, I want you to know that every soldier in this unit thinks what's happening to you is wrong. We serve our country and this is how we get treated at home. It's disgraceful. That night, Marcus lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling again. Every official channel had failed him. The HOA was hiding behind questionable policies. The property management company was hiding behind contracts. The courts were too slow to help. His own military could not protect him from civilians who were stealing his home while he served overseas. But Colonel Williams had said something interesting. Every soldier in the unit thought this was wrong. Marcus had always believed that soldiers took care of each other. Maybe it was time to stop fighting this battle alone. Maybe it was time to call in reinforcements. Marcus picked up his phone and started texting his fellow soldiers. If the system would not help him, maybe his brothers in arms would. After all, they had sworn an oath to defend their country against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Right now, it felt like the enemies were the people back home who were stealing from soldiers while they served overseas. Marcus Chen stood in his living room, looking around at everything he would miss for the next 9 months. The coffee mug on the kitchen counter still had his morning coffee stains. His favorite chair sat empty by the window where he liked to read the newspaper every Sunday. Soon all of this would be just a memory until he came back home. The deployment orders had come 3 weeks ago. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen was going overseas with his unit. 9 months in a place where the sun was too hot and the nights were too cold. 9 months away from his small house on Maple Street. Away from his neighbors who always waved when he mowed the lawn. Away from everything that felt like home. Marcus had bought the house 2 years ago when he got promoted. It was not big or fancy, but it was his. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a small yard where he planned to plant tomatoes someday. The house sat in a quiet neighborhood called Sunset Hills. All the houses looked similar, with neat lawns and mailboxes that matched. It was the kind of place where kids rode bikes in the street and neighbors borrowed sugar from each other. The neighborhood had something called a homeowners association, or HOA for short. Marcus did not know much about HOAs when he bought the house. His real estate agent had explained that the HOA made sure all the houses looked nice and followed certain rules. They collected money every month from each homeowner to pay for things like landscaping and street repairs. Marcus thought it sounded reasonable enough. Every month, Marcus paid his HOA dues on time. $55 automatically came out of his bank account on the first day of each month. He had set it up that way so he would never forget to pay. Marcus was the kind of person who paid all his bills early and kept his receipts organized in folders. Being in the military had taught him to be responsible with money and paperwork. Now, with deployment coming, Marcus needed to make sure everything would run smoothly while he was gone. He spent days making lists and checking things twice. His mortgage payment was already automatic. His car insurance, phone bill, and internet were all set to pay themselves. He had enough money in his checking account to cover everything for the entire 9 months, plus extra for emergencies. The lawn care took some planning. Marcus had always cut his own grass and trimmed his own bushes. He enjoyed working in the yard on Saturday mornings when the air was cool and the coffee was still warm in his travel mug. But he could not cut grass from thousands of miles away. He hired a local company called Green Thumb Landscaping. They would come every 2 weeks to cut the grass, trim the hedges, and keep everything looking neat. Marcus paid them for the entire 9 months up front. He also needed to tell his neighbors he was leaving. Mrs. Rodriguez lived next door to the left. She was a grandmother who baked cookies for the whole street during holidays. She promised to keep an eye on his house and collect any packages that might be delivered. She had his phone number and email address in case anything strange happened. Mr. Johnson lived on the other side. He was retired from the post office and spent most of his time working on old cars in his garage. He told Marcus not to worry about anything. If he saw anyone who did not belong near the house, he would call the police right away. Mr. Johnson had served in Vietnam many years ago, so he understood what it meant to leave home for military duty. The most important task was notifying the HOA. Marcus had received a thick packet of rules and guidelines when he bought the house. Somewhere in those pages he remembered reading about extended absences. Homeowners were supposed to tell the HOA if they would be away for more than 30 days. Since 9 months was definitely more than 30 days, Marcus knew he needed to follow the rules. He found the HOA contact information in his house files. The current president was a woman named Patricia Wells. She lived 4 streets over in a house with a perfectly manicured lawn and flower boxes that always had fresh flowers. Marcus had met her once at a neighborhood barbecue. She seemed nice enough, though she talked a lot about property values and keeping the neighborhood looking prestigious. Marcus wrote a formal letter to the HOA board. He explained that he was being deployed overseas for military service. He included his exact dates of departure and expected return. He provided his military email address and phone number for emergencies. He also included Mrs. Rodriguez's contact information as his local emergency contact. Marcus made copies of everything and mailed the letter with delivery confirmation so he would have proof they received it. 3 days before his deployment, Marcus walked through his house one final time. He had moved all his important documents to a safety deposit box at the bank. Family photos were packed away in closets to protect them from dust. He had cleaned out the refrigerator and unplugged everything except the basic appliances that needed to stay running. The house felt empty but ready. Marcus had done everything he could think of to prepare. His bills would pay themselves, his yard would stay neat, and his neighbors would watch over everything. He had followed all the HOA rules and given them plenty of notice about his deployment. What could possibly go wrong? On his last night, Marcus sat in his favorite chair by the window. The street was quiet except for the sound of sprinklers watering lawns and the distant hum of air conditioners. Mrs. Rodriguez had brought over a plate of homemade cookies as a going-away gift. Mr. Johnson had stopped by to shake his hand and wish him luck. Even Patricia Wells from the HOA had sent a nice email thanking him for his service and promising the board would take good care of the neighborhood while he was gone. Marcus felt peaceful as he locked his front door for the last time. His keys went to Mrs. Rodriguez for emergencies only. His mail would be held at the post office. His house would sit quietly and wait for him to come home, just like houses had waited for soldiers throughout history. The next morning, a military transport took Marcus away from Sunset Hills. As the plane climbed into the sky, he looked down at the tiny houses getting smaller and smaller below. Somewhere down there was his house on Maple Street, safe and secure, waiting for his return. He had no way of knowing that his careful planning was about to be destroyed by the very people he had trusted to protect his home. Marcus Chen stood in his living room, looking around at everything he would miss for the next 9 months. The coffee mug on the kitchen counter still had his morning coffee stains. His favorite chair sat empty by the window where he liked to read the newspaper every Sunday. Soon all of this would be just a memory until he came back home. The deployment orders had come 3 weeks ago. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen was going overseas with his unit. 9 months in a place where the sun was too hot and the nights were too cold. 9 months away from his small house on Maple Street. Away from his neighbors who always waved when he mowed the lawn. Away from everything that felt like home. Marcus had bought the house 2 years ago when he got promoted. It was not big or fancy, but it was his. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a small yard where he planned to plant tomatoes someday. The house sat in a quiet neighborhood called Sunset Hills. All the houses looked similar, with neat lawns and mailboxes that matched. It was the kind of place where kids rode bikes in the street and neighbors borrowed sugar from each other. The neighborhood had something called a homeowners association, or HOA for short. Marcus did not know much about HOAs when he bought the house. His real estate agent had explained that the HOA made sure all the houses looked nice and followed certain rules. They collected money every month from each homeowner to pay for things like landscaping and street repairs. Marcus thought it sounded reasonable enough. Every month, Marcus paid his HOA dues on time. $55 automatically came out of his bank account on the first day of each month. He had set it up that way so he would never forget to pay. Marcus was the kind of person who paid all his bills early and kept his receipts organized in folders. Being in the military had taught him to be responsible with money and paperwork. Now with deployment coming, Marcus needed to make sure everything would run smoothly while he was gone. He spent days making lists and checking things twice. His mortgage payment was already automatic. His car insurance, phone bill, and internet were all set to pay themselves. He had enough money in his checking account to cover everything for the entire 9 months, plus extra for emergencies. The lawn care took some planning. Marcus had always cut his own grass and trimmed his own bushes. He enjoyed working in the yard on Saturday mornings when the air was cool and the coffee was still warm in his travel mug. But he could not cut grass from thousands of miles away. He hired a local company called Green Thumb Landscaping. They would come every 2 weeks to cut the grass, trim the hedges, and keep everything looking neat. Marcus paid them for the entire 9 months up front. He also needed to tell his neighbors he was leaving. Mrs. Rodriguez lived next door to the left. She was a grandmother who baked cookies for the whole street during holidays. She promised to keep an eye on his house and collect any packages that might be delivered. She had his phone number and email address in case anything strange happened. Mr. Johnson lived on the other side. He was retired from the post office and spent most of his time working on old cars in his garage. He told Marcus not to worry about anything. If he saw anyone who did not belong near the house, he would call the police right away. Mr. Johnson had served in Vietnam many years ago, so he understood what it meant to leave home for military duty. The most important task was notifying the HOA. Marcus had received a thick packet of rules and guidelines when he bought the house. Somewhere in those pages he remembered reading about extended absences. Homeowners were supposed to tell the HOA if they would be away for more than 30 days. Since 9 months was definitely more than 30 days, Marcus knew he needed to follow the rules. He found the HOA contact information in his house files. The current president was a woman named Patricia Wells. She lived 4 streets over in a house with a perfectly manicured lawn and flower boxes that always had fresh flowers. Marcus had met her once at a neighborhood barbecue. She seemed nice enough, though she talked a lot about property values and keeping the neighborhood looking prestigious. Marcus wrote a formal letter to the HOA board. He explained that he was being deployed overseas for military service. He included his exact dates of departure and expected return. He provided his military email address and phone number for emergencies. He also included Mrs. Rodriguez's contact information as his local emergency contact. Marcus made copies of everything and mailed the letter with delivery confirmation, so he would have proof they received it. 3 days before his deployment, Marcus walked through his house one final time. He had moved all his important documents to a safety deposit box at the bank. Family photos were packed away in closets to protect them from dust. He had cleaned out the refrigerator and unplugged everything except the basic appliances that needed to stay running. The house felt empty, but ready. Marcus had done everything he could think of to prepare. His bills would pay themselves, his yard would stay neat, and his neighbors would watch over everything. He had followed all the HOA rules and given them plenty of notice about his deployment. What could possibly go wrong? On his last night, Marcus sat in his favorite chair by the window. The street was quiet except for the sound of sprinklers watering lawns and the distant hum of air conditioners. Mrs. Rodriguez had brought over a plate of homemade cookies as a going-away gift. Mr. Johnson had stopped by to shake his hand and wish him luck. Even Patricia Wells from the HOA had sent a nice email thanking him for his service and promising the board would take good care of the neighborhood while he was gone. Marcus felt peaceful as he locked his front door for the last time. His keys went to Mrs. Rodriguez for emergencies only. His mail would be held at the post office. His house would sit quietly and wait for him to come home, just like houses had waited for soldiers throughout history. The next morning, a military transport took Marcus away from Sunset Hills. As the plane climbed into the sky, he looked down at the tiny houses getting smaller and smaller below. Somewhere down there was his house on Maple Street, safe and secure, waiting for his return. He had no way of knowing that his careful planning was about to be destroyed by the very people he had trusted to protect his home.